So now we're going to look at the community-based model. Here's what I mean by this. This is the model that we're going to use when we go through each individual community. It's going to start with the historical context, and then we're going to look at the community through several different lenses. The community-based model is actually a very good way. A good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Monica Black, she took the, I always try to pronounce this, so I'm going to try and get this right. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which is the macro system, exosystem, microsystem, and individual. She took that, and then she added the historical context to it so that we can draw a much more clear picture of the delicate intricacies of each community. So we're going to take all of that, and then we're going to filter that into trauma-informed care. But we first have to understand the historical context. And since we're talking about historical context, the next thing is historical trauma. So we first have to understand what historical trauma is. So historical trauma refers to cumulative emotional and psychological wounding extending over an individual lifespan and across generations caused by traumatic experiences. Historical trauma responses, HTR, the way we respond to historical trauma within our community. Those particular responses are usually challenges that you have to deal with when serving clients. They're usually responding to some type of historical trauma within their community. We're going to go over in detail what those responses look like, but I want to draw your attention to page 49, the very last part of the second paragraph. The HTR often includes other types of self-destructive behaviors, suicidal thoughts and gestures, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. Associated with historical trauma responses is historical unresolved grief that accompanies the trauma, the unresolved grief. We want to put them on a path to recovery. We want to get that grief solved, dealt with. Now let's look at these individual responses to historical trauma. A lot of you have seen these responses in your line of work through the years. So a lot of these are going to look familiar to you. So we're talking about very specific responses to historical trauma, and then we're going to tweak what that looks like within very specific communities. Grief accompanies trauma when it goes unresolved. But sometimes we don't even know what it is that the person is grieving. For me, I was grieving at the loss of feeling protected. At one point, even as a young girl, I thought I was protected. And when that got taken from me, I grieved the loss of that. I did not discover that until I talked to a professional. There's no way I would have been able to deduce that on my own, or at least from where I stand right now, knowing where I was at the time when I went for help. I would not have been able to figure that out. I grieved the loss of protection from people who were supposed to do that. Depression. I'm sure you've treated people who have displayed signs of depression. Attempts to numb the pain. Alcohol, gambling. For me, it was binge eating. Eating made me feel good, mostly because it made me go to sleep. And if I go to sleep, I don't have to deal with anything until I wake up. Energy drinks, drugs, prescription drug use, sexual promiscuity, anything to numb what it is that you're feeling. I just don't want to feel this, so I have to do something else. Suicide, the gestures and ideation. Sometimes people, and I can attest to this, who are thinking about suicide, just the idea of not having to deal with whatever it is that's happening right now, the idea of not having to deal with that is very appealing. whatever this is that I'm going through right now, it'll all be over very soon. And for some people who attempt to commit suicide on a much deeper level, don't really want it to happen, but they want someone to say, hey, I hear your cry for help. Because they don't really know how to go out and tell someone, I'm feeling this way. Fixation to the trauma. They're fixed on it. I'm a victim and I cannot let this go. I'm a victim and I absolutely cannot let this go. For whatever reason, they are fixed on what happened. Almost every time you talk to them, that's the only topic of conversation. That's on, yeah, but you don't know what happened to me. I have to tell you what happened to me. The fixation on the trauma. And they isolate people when they do that, because sometimes when people see them coming, they're like, oh goodness, I already know what they're going to talk about. Go in the other direction. I don't feel like hearing that today. Survivor guilt. For survivor guilt, some of them feel like, my ancestors, my lineage, they went through such grave circumstances and conditions, and I don't have to go through that. And there's this survivor guilt that happens with that, especially if you are, I don't want to say hit over the head, but if your family stresses the fact that your family history was very traumatic. You don't know how good you got it. Your great grandmother. I mean, when you hear that over and over and over again, there's a level of survivor guilt that comes along with that. Psychic numbing. With psychic numbing is the condition brought on by trauma resulting in the incapacity to express emotions or love or closeness. That psychic numbing, sometimes you want to think about anything else other than what's hurting you. Anything else will do but this. And you just don't connect with another person. Loyalty to ancestral suffering and the deceased. It's similar to the survivor guilt. They identify their existence through the suffering of their ancestors. That's how they identify themselves. I am here because my ancestors suffered. That's the only reason why I'm here. And that loyalty sometimes doesn't let them prosper the way they really could. Idealizing how life should be as opposed to the way it really is. That's also referred to as compensatory fantasies. This is how my life really should be. And because it's not, I'm in trouble. I'm doing something wrong. Something's not right. Sometimes parents, we love our children, but sometimes we put it in their mind, this is what you should be doing with your life. And some of the children believe them. So if they're not there, they have this sense of guilt, like, oh, I'm not where I'm supposed to be in my life. Vitality in our own life is seen as a betrayal to ancestors who suffered so much. You are seeing a lot of things about ancestral suffrage right now. That is very prevalent in a lot of communities. Don't ever forget where you came from. Don't ever forget what your ancestors did for you. Attachment failure. The inability to get emotionally attached to anyone. This is passed down from generation to generation. There are some people who tell me, my dad never hugged me. Or my mom never hugged me. I knew they loved me, but, they never really showed that affection towards me. And the ability for that person to emotionally and connect with another person, they don't know what it looks like. And it's difficult for them to do it. Generational physical trauma. There was genetic evidence that trauma can be physically passed down to an unborn child. I found that fascinating. Great disparity in the standardized testing models. We have some very smart people within these communities. The way the standardized testing models are designed, there's this huge disparity. So for a lot of them, it's like, I feel so stupid. Why am I not getting this? People who create standardized testing models often don't have cultural competencies. They don't understand the historical context of these very specific communities. They don't get it. And anytime you create a one-size-fits-all model, there's going to be a lot of disparities and flaws in it. Delayed traumatic triggers. So I'll give you an example. Shortly after 9/11, about 4 days after 9/11, there was a group of survivors who were in a room. Someone came into the room. They didn't know the person came in, and the door slammed behind them. 4 days after the attacks, and then you hear delayed traumatic triggers. For the people in that room, it was almost as if it was happening all over again, even though there was no real danger that was present. Delayed traumatic triggers. When people can isolate a single traumatic event, sometimes they hold on to it and it resurfaces in an instant. Even though there's no real danger, it takes them right back to that space.